Many thanks to Daniela for playing for us this evening as we've been gathering. Thank you. It's been lovely to have some music over these last sessions to just get us in the mood. It's been my misfortune that I haven't been able to attend many of these lectures since Marcus began the series. So it's lovely to be able to catch up with this one, which really takes us to the heart of Beverley's origins and the sense of Beverley as a shrine and a place to which people came in order to pray at the tomb of St John. So a very warm welcome to everybody. It's lovely to see you. And without further ado, I'm going to hand over to Marcus Ramshaw, who's going to speak to us on the Shrine of St John, Miracles and Healing in Medieval Beverley, 1100 to 1540. Over to you, Marcus.
Well, good evening and welcome on what is still quite a muggy, sultry evening. I looked at the BBC weather. It was 25 degrees in Beverley at 6 o'clock. You're looking forward, or maybe like me or not, because I sweat for England at the best of times. The last heat wave was awful. There's going to be a second heat wave on the weekend, so you're back up to 30, 31 degrees on Saturday and Sunday, with weather warnings issued. There were some miracles attributed to St John of Beverley as actually being a weather worker, who actually rescued several times Beverley's crops and fields from there being an excessive drought and an inadequacy of rain. There are 2 or 3 miracles which, if we get time, we might cover tonight. But first of all, can everybody hear me with this clip-on mic? Because I know it's quite easy to get lost up in the roof. Now, I've given you all a handout. Has everybody got sight of the handout? Because you are going to read it during this talk. There's only a couple left. I did 65, so there should be enough if you share. I have almost wondered about sending out a roving mic in the second half of the talk, because I'm going to ask you to do some work for me, because this is a work in progress. Because there's a lot of really original, well, all of this is either original new research or it is based on a very recent PhD by Susan Wilson, which was only published in 2006 from the University of Southampton, called The Lives and the Afterlives of St John of Beverley. Isn't it wonderful to have an afterlife? An afterlife which is quite a literal one, not one that just remains in people's memories or old photographs. So I'm going to talk for 20 minutes, giving you some background to St John of Beverley. A lot of it you will know, but some of it you won't. I'm also going to talk about that forgotten saint in Beverley, but not in history, not in England, and certainly not in France, where until Joan of Arc, who wasn't actually canonized until as recently as 1920, is since then the patron saint of France. But the patron saint of France is also our joint saint here in Beverley, St Martin of Tours, because you are sitting not in the Minster parish, as I've just shown to Jonathan on the map, but in the parish of St Martin. And Beverley Minster is dedicated to them both, St John the Evangelist and St Martin. And then just to make it even more complicated, we've got St John of Beverley, who's buried here. So I'm going to talk for 20 minutes, and then we're going to work through, if we have time, 6 or 7 different miracles. And I'm going to try to do something which is part historical, part theological, and certainly, I hope, part scientific. And I'm going to try to walk a tread rope between being a firm, devout Christian believer myself, but also being a rational scientific man. So, please bear with me, and that's why I will invite questions potentially throughout the second half. So you will need those handouts, and do take them away, because I'd like to get your thoughts about them afterwards. Basically, I'm going to try to ask you, how did these miracles happen? Can you provide me with a rational, scientific explanation for them? So, this is very much a work in progress, and I actually would, pietistically, rather hear from St John of Beverley himself than you heard from me. So that's why I always talk too long. I have kept my talk strictly down to 2,000 words. But you know me, I'll wander off and probably talk about some nonsense for a while and then come back to the point. So Jonathan, please interrupt me quite mercilessly if I do. Now, let us be clear from our starting point. I am a committed Christian. I don't expect you to be. And this is certainly not an evangelistic talk, but I do believe in miracles. And just like the song, I actually do believe miracles happen. But I also am, I hope, an intelligent man with a questioning scientific mind. And miracles are weird. They don't make sense. How could they? If they did, then, well, are they still a miracle? So what is a miracle? And I want us to explore that tonight, how we might use and understand the word miracle. So I've already declared my hand, but yours might be different. And then we can discuss some of the remarkable 70 up to 75 miracles attributed to St John of Beverley. The discrepancy is there are 5 miracles which are basically repeated with a bit of extra detail. Now for me, miracles happen all the time. And they open to me and to the world the interface between both science and religion. They remind us that God is active in its creation, that strange things happen, and that we can have both a spirituality and a scientific mind which need not be in conflict with each other. So what makes a miracle? St. Augustine of Hippo in the 4th century, the most influential Christian writer and thinker after the Bible, describes that the greatest miracle of miracles is the world itself. And that is something which I will come back to and gives hope to us all. But I'm going to focus on the astonishingly detailed and historically highly verified stories of St John of Beverley, who now is largely, outside of Beverley, somewhat forgotten to say the least, but actually was the second most powerful saint in northern England, arguably after St Cuthbert, but actually a saint whose international importance far outstrips the British Isles. And he has an enormous amount of miracles written about him over a period of nearly 800 years. And also, alongside him, I'm going to talk about what I think is his inspirer, St Martin of Tours in France, who lived in the 4th and 5th centuries, nearly 200 years before St John of Beverley was born. And I will return to St Martin a lot. St Martin's church existed alongside the Minster right up until after the Reformation. And if you look at the back of the church in the extreme left-hand corner, from where I am, past the font, you will see a door in that corner, a door that goes nowhere. That is the entrance to St Martin's Church, which was built all on the outside in the graveyard, a large building, which was demolished after the Reformation, along with the chapter house, to fund the £100 required to save the rest of the Minster being pulled down. But even though that was sacrificed, the parish of St Martin was not. You had the provost of Beverley Minster, who ran this place, and a staff of 72 clergy helping him. And there were several altars. There were at least 7 or 8 prebends, as they was known, or canons. There was the canon of St Catherine, in St Catherine's Chapel over there. There was a canon of St Christopher, which would have been the altar near the door where you came in. There'll be a canon of St. Mary's, which is now thought of as being in the retro choir behind the high altar, but actually I don't think it's there. I think it's actually under the clergy and choir vestries. And there was the prebend of St. Martin. If you look at the streets around Minster Avenue, you can see the names of some of these prebendaries. That's why you have a St. Andrew's Street. And that's why you have a St. David's Close, because there was a chapel probably somewhere around there to St. Andrew, and one to St. David somewhere else. But the wealthiest of all these prebendaries was St. Martin. And St. Martin was different because he was the only one. These other canons, basically, just spent most of their time as chantry priests singing masses for souls, and perhaps doing some admin work. But the parish of St. Martin, the vicar, the prebend of St. Martin, did all the donkey work that Jonathan and his clergy do today. They did the confessions, the baptisms, the pastoral visiting, the funerals, the weddings, the work of a parish priest in this parish of St. Martin, which covered most of Highgate and went right up to Flemingate. There's a map of it hereafter. It actually still exists. So I've just completely gone off piste and talked to you about St. Martin. You didn't interrupt, Jonathan. I should have been talking about what is a miracle. But we're going to have to come back to St. Martin at various points. Now, the Oxford English Dictionary defines a miracle as a surprising and welcome event that is not explicable by natural or scientific laws and is often considered the work of a divine agency. But it can also refer to an unexpected or lucky event that is highly improbable or extraordinary. Now, the very word miracle in English is derived from the Latin word mirabulum, which literally means an object of wonder. It doesn't go any further in defining it. Miracles are often associated with religious contexts, where they are seen as events caused by either a divine power or supernatural force that defies or perhaps extends the laws of nature. But in a broader sense, a miracle can simply refer to an event that is very surprising, improbable, against the odds. It is a miracle that you won the lottery last week. You know the odds were 6 million to 1 against you winning it. And yet somebody does win the lottery every week. But I wouldn't normally bet on a 6 million to 1 odd. Now, a miracle, perhaps in our language, doesn't necessarily require a religious explanation. But tonight I am going to be looking for some religious explanation to it. The obvious miracles that I'm sure you've all heard, perhaps back in Sunday school days, although actually I never went to Sunday school, are things such as healing. That's what most pilgrims came to ask for St John of Beverley at his shrine. Or, in the case of Jesus, turning water into wine. Or a person surviving a seemingly utterly impossible accident. And one of the main miracles I'm going to explore with you, which most of your feedback, is actually in that last category, the extraordinary accident. Now, whilst I was doing the research on this talk, and I've been researching it for the past 3 or 4 months in reality, it was astonishing to watch your topic appear on the BBC News, such as the single British national sitting in seat 11A of the Indian Boeing airplane disaster, who was the only one of 242 passengers to survive, including his brother, who was sitting next to him, but who didn't just survive, but actually walked away, physically, almost unscathed. Is that a miracle? I mean, I think it is. What are the odds? Even if we could find an explanation why he survived, and Sue has kindly given one potentially to me, that he walked away before a fireball engulfed the whole place and there might be others that survived. Even if that were the case, what are the odds that you would put on him surviving? It wouldn't be 6 million to 1. It would be about 6 trillion to 1. wouldn't it? To have walked away as well. Now, for me, that's a miracle. The first usage of the noun miracle in English appears actually surprisingly late, only sometime prior to the 12th century in the Anglo-Saxon Chronicle. Anyway, we'll come back to that, and I've already spoken for over 10 minutes. So I'm going to have to give you a quick outline of the life of St John of Beverley to recap him before we look at his afterlife in respect to his cult, his miracles, and his legacy. He was born, I'm sure many of you know, in Harpham, near Driffield, sometime in the first half of the 7th century. We'll try to estimate his date of birth. It's probably between 640 and 660, which would have made him into his 70s or 80s when he died. It's certainly in that ballpark. We know he had a very, very good education, the best education possible of his day, the equivalent of Oxford and Cambridge before Oxford and Cambridge were actually founded, because he was educated at Canterbury under St. Adrian, or Hadrian of Canterbury, an abbot who was African by birth, which is interesting. We don't know if he was black or white, but he came into contact with the leading scholars of the day, and it was a comprehensive education. It was on his return to Yorkshire, he became a monk at St. Hilda's double monastery of both men and women in Whitby. And in 687, he was consecrated as the Bishop of Hexham. He was reputed to have shown special care for the poor and the handicapped, and would become seen as a patron saint of the deaf and the mute. He personally knew the Venerable Bede, the father of English history, church history, and in fact ordained him as a priest. Bede is the first author of his miracles, and this is important to us as historians because Bede, the father of English history, a very reliable source, he lists 5 miracles at least attributed to St John of Beverley, and it's clear that these must be either eyewitness accounts or first-hand accounts. That's rare, and it's unique for this period, the so-called Dark Ages. And these are confirmed by Alcuin in the 8th century, who actually was the brain box of Anglo-Saxon Europe and establishes in York, a pre-university. In 705, St. John was made Bishop of York, which always confuses people. Why wasn't he Archbishop? Well, it's only 30 years later that York becomes an archbishopric in 735. So he's one of the last bishops of York. St. John carefully avoids the febrile and hostile state and church politics of his day, which had become particularly poisoned by one of his rival saints, St. Wilfrid of Ripon, who was doing his best to try to get various other people fired as bishops so he could pinch his jobs and put in his own party. And there's a whole tension between the Celtic Church and the Roman Church. But St. John stays above that, even though he is the Bishop of York. And he does it deliberately. He becomes known for himself often going wandering off into secluding parts of then rural Tyneside for a prayerful half-hermit-like life. And then sometime in the very early 8th century, he has, I'm sure you all know, founded a monastery in a wood surrounded by marshland in a place called Beverley. And subsequently, a place that had not been occupied in any significant way before a town would develop. He retired to live in the monastery in 717, about 4 years before his death there, in 721 on May the 7th. As well as Bede, Alcuin also records his miracles, but he largely just develops and extends what Bede has recorded, although he does it with considerable extra detail in a remarkable poetic manner. In spite of all this, to become a saint, he became a saint either by canonization from Rome by the Pope, or by popular acclaim by the people, or by martyrdom. Anybody who was martyred in the early church was automatically considered a saint. St. John isn't actually canonized as a saint until 1037, just before the Norman conquest, surprisingly late, considering he died in 721. But then, St Joan of Arc was burnt to death in 1420, and it takes 500 years for her to be made a saint, and she's the patron saint of France. Interestingly, though, St John of Beverley just survives the Norman conquest by being consecrated as a saint in 1037. I suspect if that hadn't happened after 1066, I doubt William Conqueror would have let St John of Beverley have that much of a chance, because he's an Anglo-Saxon. He's also canonized just prior to the Great Schism between the Western Catholic and the Eastern Orthodox churches of Russia and Greece and all that lot in 1054, which means that he is still revered as a saint in both churches, in both the West and in the East, and so throughout Christendom. As you know, King Athelstan, the first king of United England, claimed he had victory and overlordship of Scotland because of the miracles and power of St John of Beverley. A claim frequently and loudly used repeatedly by Edward I in his petitions to the Pope and elsewhere in his attempt to subjugate Scotland in the 14th century. The banner of St John, which was housed in Beverley Minster, was used several times by English kings in their battles, confident that it would give them victory. King Edward I built a chantry in Beverley Minster for him, and a very expensive shrine and a new tomb in the Minster, into which St John of Beverley's remains were translated, that is, moved and reburied on October the 25th, 1307. And that is why St John has two feast days each year, May the 7th, his death day, and October the 25th, the feast of his translation and new shrine. The contract for the building of the shrine survives between the chapter, the governing body of Beverley Minster, and the master mason, Roger de Farringdon, work being commissioned in 1292. And it specifies the creation of a silver gilt shrine made from gold and silver, supplied by the chapter at least 5 feet long and 1 foot wide, of proportionate height, beautiful and adorned with plates and columns, in architectural style with figures everywhere, of size and number as the chapter of canons shall determine, and canopies and pinnacles before and behind, and other proper ornaments. Roger to make any figure and remake it at the whim of the chapter. Now we get to the interesting bits. Anybody who's interested in heritage conservation or building contracts, see, in the Middle Ages, they didn't ignore rules and regulations and making sure that the builder did what they were meant to do, and they did it in time. Because it goes on to say that the pay for Roger de Farringdon was to be in silver equal to the weight of the silver he used before gilding, just in case he didn't try to take any silver away with him. That would affect how much silver he was not putting on the shrine. Also, it specifies that Roger may not undertake any other work until he has completed the shrine at Beverley Minster, which actually will take him the better part of a decade. So those little penalty clause you get in contracts, if you don't do it by this day, it's a fine of £15,000 a day or whatever, is nothing new. In 1301, Edward I personally gave 50 marks towards the building of the shrine. The mark is 2/3 of a pound, so that equals to, in old money, £33, 6 shillings and 4 pence, which allowing for inflation and also changes in the retail price index would be at least £66,000 in today's money. On top of that, he also pardoned several fines owing to the Crown by both the Minster and the town for taxes, which were at least the same, if not more, as the 50 marks. Edward I, the Hammer of the Scots, one of the most famous, and actually, I suppose, one of the most successful medieval English kings, visited Beverley Minster in 1296, 1297, and 1300, whilst mustering his army for his invasions and campaigns in Scotland, and each time took both the banner of St John and at least 1 or 2 of the chapter from Beverley Minster as a chaplain with him. Edward II, Edward III, and Henry IV also did likewise, taking the banner of St John with their military campaigns, not just in Scotland, but also in France. And, as I'm sure many of you know, King Henry V gave the credit for his victory at the Battle of Agincourt in 1415 to the miraculous intervention of St John of Beverley, the battle having been fought on the feast day of his translation on October the 25th, which happens, as Shakespeare reminds us, to also be the feast day of these two, really, whoever has heard of them, St Crispian and Crispianus, or is it Crispianum? I'm not even quite sure how to spell the second name, two really unheard of early church martyrs from 3rd century Rome, who I'm surprised even Shakespeare had heard about. They must have really had to look that one up. But on the same day, the reason St John of Beverley, certainly as far as Henry V is concerned, let's leave Shakespeare to one side, on the day of the battle, blood and oil were seen to be running from the tomb of St Beverley, of St John, in the Minster, which should be just up behind the high altar, raised above over the screen there. As a result, Henry V made John of Beverley one of the patrons of the royal household and ordered that his feast day be celebrated throughout all of England, making him a national saint, third only to St Edward the Confessor and St George. So why is he forgotten? At football matches, you shouldn't be doing the St George's flag and all that. You should be celebrating St John of Beverley as much as anything else. I mean, St George probably didn't actually exist at all as a fictitious character. I mean, the Roman Catholic Church has downgraded him to a class 3 saint because we're not quite sure he did actually ever live. And if he did, he was a Syrian in an Aleppo back in the 3rd, 4th century. He had nothing to do with a dragon, by the way. And Edward the Confessor, who never really took off much of a saint, well, St John of Beverley, as you'll see through his miracles, a much revered saint, a patron of the poor and the handicapped and the deaf and the mute, and his miracles, I'm so looking forward to sharing them with you because they are beautiful. There are rarely have I come across any, and I'm a geek who spends lots of time reading medieval saints' lives, and sometimes they're either fantastical or they're just turgid as mud. But St. John comes across as a warm, believable, patient, endearing, pastoral, gentle character. Now, I've gone off another aside, and you didn't stop me. Right, so Henry V and his new French queen, Catherine of Valois, come to Beverley in 1420 and make lavish offerings at the shrine of St. John. Now, beginning to move, I'm about to shut up soon, onto the miracles. So as well as both Bede and Alcuin account of the life of St. John, there are 6 other accounts. And the first of these we'll move to your handouts, these are the life of St. John, Bishop of York, by Fulcard, a monk and a member of the Minster community. And this is tantalizingly written at some point between 1060 and 1070. It bridges precisely that most famous gap of English history, that date, 1066. And we don't know if it's just before or just after. It's also impressive we actually can date it down so precisely, and that's partly because of the political events of the period. The second is The Miracles of St. John, Bishop of York, by William Cattell, a member of the Minster community, written between 1100, the beginning of the reign of Henry I, and circa 1140, as we move into the anarchy of King Stephen's reign and the rebellion, the civil war between Stephen and Matilda. Then there are 3 further anonymous accounts of the miracles, which we now just know as the Alia Miracala I, Alia Miracala II, and Alia Miracala III. And they survive from the early 13th century. Again, it's like St. John of Beverley is really blessing us as historians, because normally it's a nightmare trying to date medieval records, and especially hagiographical miracle accounts of a saint, because there's so much propaganda. and it's so difficult. They don't normally refer to other events, but we can date these 3 Alia Miracala better than almost anything else, better than Fulcard, because they refer in detail at the time to the Northern Barons' rebellion against King John and the signing of Magna Carta. So fortunately, we can give an Alia Miracala 1. It is definitely written between 1214 and 1216. You can narrow it down to a 2-year period. The second Alia Miracala is not long after, possibly only about 10 to 20 years. And the third is certainly before the mid-13th century. Finally, there are surviving miracles that are detailed in the surviving chapter act book of Beverley Minster, which is basically the minutes and accounts of the governing body of the Minster. And these are a continuous period that they cover between 1286 and 1347. And there are several miracles mentioned in them. Now, this covers a remarkably long period since Bede and Alcuin. An account of 70 to 75 miracles, as I said, a handful are duplicated, over a period of roughly 800 years. And I wish I could credit this as a discovery myself, but it's not at all mine, it belongs. So, bargain price of about £40 reduced on eBay is Susan Wilson's University of Southampton PhD thesis on the translation and the life and afterlife of St John of Beverley. So she's really the expert on it. She points out that, astonishingly, this is longer, that 800-year period, than any other non-biblical saint throughout all of Christendom, far eclipsing even its closest non-biblical rival, Saint Benedict, the abbot and founder of Monte Cassino, an author and founder of the Benedictine rule and the Benedictine order. Benedict's miracle account stretched over a period a little under 500 years, from the late 6th century in the writings of Pope Gregory the Great to the beginning of the 12th century, when William Kettle was still writing, just beginning to write, his life of St John of Beverley. That is incredible. I keep coming back to wonder how it is St John of Beverley has become so forgotten, because he really shouldn't be. Now, I have spoken for 20 minutes, so I will keep to my word, and we shall now look at the miracles themselves. I haven't lost anybody, have I? Have I still got your attention? I've not spoken too fast. You did not hear me. Right? Do you feel confident of asking a question you want? There will be a question and answer session at the end, I hope, where Jonathan will chair. But this is the real work in progress. Actually, I expect so much, probably my glasses will steam up. Right, it is 7:33. I shall definitely finish speaking at 8 o'clock to give you a chance to. So, if you refer to your handouts, shall we go to the most interesting and fun miracle, which puzzled me the most, which is towards the end, and you'll find it on page 204. Now, I think that might be the last one. Oh, can you? Yeah, I'm going to share. Right. Now, most of the miracles, they fall into basically 6 categories. Either a healing thing, raising from the dead, of course, no worries, Any self-respecting saint can bring you back from the dead. Might be a coma, but he can bring you back from the dead. Weather working, of course. So controlling the weather, and controlling the weather in such that if you're in a ship at sea and in a storm, St John of Beverley will calm the storm for you if you pray to him. Prison break. That's the second miracle we're going to talk about. There's a couple of prison breaks, one from Driffield Castle and one from Cottingham, which are, well, wonderful, wonderful stories. Obviously casting out demons. I think there's little doubt that there's our growing knowledge of psychology and mental health, and the guy who just murdered a 14-year-old boy in a chaotic, cannabis-induced psychopathic state on this evening's news probably could have done with St John of Beverley trying to stop him from doing that. Or what I suppose is an accident, an improbable event. Another thing which is interesting in this account, which makes these miracles, and they really, I can't stress you that the most popular book in the Middle Ages after the Bible that most people would have had, written in the 14th century, was called The Golden Legend by Jacobus de Voragine, James of Voragine. It's the Lives of the Saints in 2 volumes. St John of Beverley, of course, doesn't get a look at in this Italian-produced work. And actually, now I've just forgotten why I was going to talk about that. But anyway, St John of Beverley isn't in there. But yes, most of his accounts are really a bit dull and turgid, and you kind of think, yeah, that just sounds like, a really rather third-rate Aesop's fable or something like that, even if I were to believe it. But not in the case of St. John. And this is from the Alia Miracala 1. So, chapter 1 there, a boy who fell from the high arch of the Church of Beverley and was killed, gets up safe and sound. So, written between 1214 and 1216. Now, the point I was going to go on to make laboriously was that sometimes in the background information in these accounts, which have got very little to do with the miracle, you find an absolute gold nugget about life in Beverley and life in the country. So it happened one summer that within the cemetery enclosure of the Church of St John, Beverley Minster, on the northern side, a representation of the Sunday resurrection was performed by the words and actions of players wearing masks, as is usual. A great multitude of both sexes flocked together there, having been drawn there by various vows for pleasure, of course, or to be amazed, or for the sacred purpose of being inspired with devotion. Indeed, when a large number of people could not get in because of the dense crowd standing around, especially some who were very small in stature, several people entered into the church, either so that they might pray or to look at the paintings, or to avoid the boredom of this day through some sort of recreation and amusement. And then I'll brief off, then we'll come back to it. This is 1215. A play by the townsfolk, as usual, wearing masks in 1215. The first reference we have to any mystery plays in Beverley or in York or in Coventry or in Townley is 1367, 150 years later. And if it wasn't for this stray reference in the background to the miracle, we've just predated the history of English theatre and drama by nearly 150 years. And we wouldn't have known if we hadn't read this account. And also, they're wearing masks. Townsfolk coming together of both sexes, as usual. Whew. Right, okay. I mean, I thought that was a big deal. I just thought, wow. Yes, it was almost a miracle. So obviously I've just gone off piste again and talked about it. But, right. Then some young boys, having gone through the doorways of the church and by some lucky chance found a half-open door, through which stairs ascended to the roof, running to it with boyish recklessness, they climbed the arches of the church over the wall, step by step, with the intention, I suppose, that they might look more freely upon both the clothes and gestures of the actors, and hear their speeches more easily through the great windows of the turrets, or if there were openings anywhere in the glass windows. In this, they were imitating Zacchaeus from the Bible, who, since he was small in nature, climbed up a sycamore tree in order to see Jesus. But look, the watchmen had been told what the boys were doing. No doubt fearing the boys' rashness in wanting to see the players performing the aforementioned presentation might break the glass windows. So the wardens, basically church wardens, say, "Get down from there, you little scallywag, you're going to break that stained glass window." When you just managed to invent stained glass windows, that's expensive. No doubt fearing that the boys might break the glass windows or somehow destroy them, they chased swiftly after them. And when they had scolded those boys for their impetuosity and beaten them very soundly, they forced them to go back. But one of the boys, when he had seen the punishment of his friends, fearing to fall into the hands of the pursuing men, withdrew even higher, until by running swiftly, he reached a great cross on the far side, at that time erected above the altar of St. Martin. Standing there and looking downwards, so he's just over there, that bit of the church. He's obviously run from the north. Well, the north would have been that side. It was northeast initially. He's been chased quite a long way. Standing there and looking downwards, he carelessly put his foot on a square stone, which, since it loosened from the wall and fell off, plummeted down upon the stone pavement with a great crashing, and notwithstanding the hardness, it was smashed to smithereens. Indeed, the young boy, having been deprived of his support, struck with a dreadful stupefaction, fell to the ground, and there lay lifeless for a long time, very much like a corpse. Many people stood round, sighing heavily, groaning piteously over such an accident, grieving for his suffering with many tears. His parents wailed and tore their hair. They interspersed their cries and howling with frequent sobs, not knowing that in a short time, because of divine dispensation, their sadness was going to be changed into joy, their weeping into laughter. For God not allowing the church, which had been dedicated in his and the confessor's honor, St John of Beverley, to be defiled by, as it were, human slaughter and shedding of blood, but wanting the church to be possessed of a greater authority in the future, and also wanting to provide evidence of the truth of that representation of the resurrection. Don't forget that's what the play was about. The play was about the resurrection. A bit convenient, isn't it? But, but now we know what the subject matter of the play was, which is an extra bit for the history of English drama. Which was being performed at the same time. In the sight of everyone present, he raised up the boy, who was believed to be dead, so unharmed that there was not a single scratch to be seen on his whole body. It's almost like the British national in the Indian airplane crash. And so this was not only of the resurrection, but of the Lord's passion. For truly, through the cutting off of the stone which detached itself from the wall without human agency, the incarnation of the Lord, born of a virgin without male intervention, was clearly indicated through each fall, that is to say, both of the stone and of the boy. His passion was signified of man and God. Further, the stone that had been broken into pieces in the fall carried with it the image of a ram that had been struck down. Truly, the child was an image of Isaac, remaining unharmed. Therefore, the fall was the sign of his passion related to his human nature. Furthermore, the miracle by which he was raised up was a sign of his resurrection in accordance with his divinity. So there's a sort of standard sort of religious, sort of spiritual moral and a lesson and a sermon at the end there. What happened? Did the boy die? Did he come back to life? Do you believe the story? Is it the truth? Is it a miracle? Is this plausible? The vicar has kindly instructed me in Lectio Divina, a way of reading that you should very closely read a text to find out just exactly what it is saying. And go through it word by word. Now, I think it's a miracle, but I will hazard some suggestions how this might have happened. Before I get on to that, I don't know about you, but I get the feeling the way that has been written, particularly with the reference to the parents, the description of the people and everything, is incredibly fresh. It's certainly incredibly detailed, isn't it? You know, it paints a very vivid picture that this certainly is an eyewitness account of a play going on around the Minster. And it's quite plausible that some boys, I don't know, age 8, 9, 10, 11, 12, are climbing up to get a better view of this play. And the parents have told them off to try to bring them down. And genuinely, it's all quite credible. Apart from the little sermonizing at the end, I think the monk who wrote this, or Canon of the Minster, it's anonymous, did see this. And it has a ring of sincerity about it. He's telling you the truth as he believes it. And he's quite careful in that closely reading. He said, the boy fell from a great height. We're not told exactly how high, but he's climbed up several times, a great height. He falls and hits the stone floor, and he remains there like a corpse, seeming death. On the close reading of the text, like a corpse. But still, and I've tried this with several people, I thought, well, can we realistically explain this? Well, let's sort of think about how I think it might happen. Let's see if you can interrupt me if either you think that's just bonkers, or I'm clutching at straws, or I'm going too far, or I'm just desperately trying to find a way to get out of this scientifically. I spoke to a friend recently, and he said, Marcus, you know, as a medieval historian, have you ever heard of Occam's razor? And William of Ockham of Oxford was a 14th century philosopher and theologian. Basically, he came up with the maxim that whenever you're faced with a problem, the simplest explanation is normally correct. That is Occam's razor. If you're working too hard to try to convince me of this, then there's something wrong. You are overplaying your hand. Well, 1214, 1215. Well, one thing that always struck me is that we know at this time Beverley Minster has been burnt down by a fire in 1188. It only starts to really get rebuilt from about 1210. The entire cathedral is a building site. It is covered with scaffolding. It is covered with scaffolding, with ladders, with ropes, with cranes, with treadmills. It's full of sand pits. There are bits of the Minster which are still being rebuilt and bits that are being pulled down because of a devastating fire. We also know that the Minster, they're just at this point beginning to build the Minster as you see it today in the 1220s, and it's going to continue being a building site for the next 100, 150 years. We forget that when we think of medieval Beverley, we think it's full of a magnificent Minster, and St Mary's, another building. But actually, it's all a big building site, because it takes about 150 years to build this. And they've got to bring the stone all the way from Tadcaster and Sherburn and Elmet. Not only is it a building site of stonemasons, it's surrounded by blacksmiths, master glaziers, carpenters, ancillary sort of businesses, and they're trying to get these huge bits of stone on tread wheels. It's still amazing how on earth they've managed to build the Western Towers and build that up there. It's a miracle, yes. On with the miracle. On with the miracle. Right, okay. So that's the building site. Sandpit. That leads me onto the stone. The Minster's built from magnesium limestone. We're told it smashes into smithereens. Magnesium limestone is a very soft stone. That's why it's chosen for carving. It's a very rare stone as well. So I suspect that's symbolic that and it fell off. So we know that there was either a flaw in this stone, and that's why it smashed to smithereens in a way that the boy didn't. And it may have had a flaw from the fire, a bit that was meant to be removed. So I'm explaining a bit of it now. And I was getting desperate, so I just went to Google and typed, all right, artificial intelligence, help me out here. I just typed in a search engine, what is the maximum distance a human can fall and survive? I just wondered what would come back. You know, this new AI summary that comes up. I was quite surprised. It said the mean average, 51% or more, chance of survival, there's a 51 or more percent chance of survival of a fall from 50 feet. 50 feet. That's 5 stories. All right. Jonathan, how? 50 feet. What would that take us to? I'll take it to above the arches, wouldn't it? We'd be up quite close to the terrace story. At least. We're pretty much the top of the organ. Would take us down. You have a 75% chance or more of survival of a fall of 40 feet or over. Plus, a child is far more likely to survive than an adult because they've got much more supple bones. Plus, let's get real physics about it. It isn't really necessarily the length, the distance you fall. It is gravity and the velocity with which you hit the ground and also how you hit the ground. I mean, if you hit the ground with your head or neck, you can be killed in falling off your bike. If you hit with the ground with your feet, and if you're like a parachutist is taught and you do that and roll, you're far more likely to survive. And yes, maybe it will make some difference about how fat you were or what clothes you were wearing if you were a chubby boy. But it also depends on, well, what's the ground you've hit? Well, I told you it was a building site. What if the boy hit a sandpit? He landed into the sandpit. Would he not have survived? Well, we've already established he's got at least a 51% chance of survival, according, if we can believe artificial intelligence, because I was shocked. I thought, well, at least I learned one thing. If my house does ever get on fire, and I'm trapped upstairs, then jumping out of a second-story window is not going to bother me anywhere near as much as it might have done, although don't do this at home. But I will certainly pray to St John of Beverley as well. There is, and just to test it, I then Googled, because I had a vague memory of 2 stories on the BBC News, of 2 women who had fallen 30,000 feet from a Boeing 747 aircraft and survived and still live to tell this tale. And it's true, there are 2 accounts. And I found them on Wikipedia. It's got a photograph of one, Vesna Vulovic in 1970. He was an air stewardess. In 1970, JHU flight, Serbian flight attendant. The highest fall without a parachute from 33,333 feet, 10 kilometers. She landed in the Amazon rainforest. The canopy of the trees basically saved her. Also, the other case was another flight attendant, about the same period, another woman, I've got her as well, you can check these afterwards, Julianne Kopke, who was a flight attendant who somehow, miraculously, got caught in the luggage trolley, which then got caught in the fuselage of the breaking up plane as it started to nosedive. Somehow the luggage trolley in the fuselage acted as a sort of cocoon and went it on a diagonal trajectory, which actually meant that it hit the ground in a different way to the aircraft, and she survived. She was the only survivor. Is that a miracle? I mean, the odds, what are the odds? 65 trillion to 1 or something like that. But it's true. And she lived to tell it. I was completely verified. She was the only survivor. You know, it was very easy to verify all these things. So, where else am I going to go with this particular miracle? I've realized I've probably taken all the time on that one miracle account. Because there's several other things that we can deduce from it as well. It's the velocity at which the boy hits the ground. If the scaffolding around, it's quite possible he managed to grab, albeit briefly, a pole, a ladder, a bit of rope, which would have slowed his descent, its velocity. Because after all, you know, gravity will become a constant. You will not go any faster and then that speed when you're hitting the ground. But if you can stop hitting the velocity of gravity, your chance of survival goes up exponentially as a consequence. Right, okay, what's the verdict? Have I provided an explanation for that miracle? Yeah, absolutely. That is true. That is very true. Good close reading of the text as well, actually. The people do cry out, and that's not stated. Well, yeah, okay, fair enough. Let's find one in which there is intercession required. So,
just one other point on that, Marcus. The comparison is made at the end with the story of Isaac. And in the story of Isaac, famously, Isaac doesn't die.
Yeah. Yes, the sermon bit at the end. So, okay. So why is this story in there? Yes.
You said that it was anonymously recorded by multiple recurring times.
Not unusual. Well, that's why I said, does this sound sincere in its reading to you? The description detail.
The miracles attracted people to the Minster of pilgrims, that brought money to the Minster. Would there not be an ulterior motive to promote miracles?
But, yeah, well, by this stage, it's already been a pilgrimage site for at least 500 to 600 years, and there's been loads of people coming anyway. It seems like a very everyday sort of town event that's happening in the play and then putting on. So I don't get the impression that this is being used particularly to fill up the coffers, in which way that some other miracle accounts might be, particularly earlier ones. And actually, this isn't a very widely distributed text either. Alcuin and Bede have already done that, and Kettle and Fulcard. So, no, I mean, but at the end of the day, like lots of historical things, you've got to take it on a certain, ironically, a certain degree of faith. Do you believe this text or not? Historically, it's absolutely verifiable in terms of its dates. It has the ring of sincerity about it. It is unusually detailed, and I mean, what sense did you have of the tone and style of which it was being written, excluding that last sort of paragraph of the sermonizing, which is always standard in any miracle account? I don't know. I'll leave that as a sort of open question. But let's go, because I know it's 5 to 8. Let's go to the prison break, pages 183 to 186. To 186, so I think I've got Driffield Castle scrawled over in my appalling handwriting. It's in the middle. Now, there are two stories here. First is a prison break from 186. Yeah. Chapter 5 of again from the same source, the Alia Miracala, number 1, so it's written between 1214 and 1216. Chapter 5, another imprisoned clerk freed from the same place through St John. Right, shall I speed read this quickly? You can still follow me if I speed read it. I'll summarise parts of it. Right, this is in the Baron's first civil war against King John, which is going to lead to him signing Magna Carta, and Yorkshire is engulfed in this way. So, the first story just before this, St John has rescued a guy in Cottingham Castle who's about to be tortured by nasty barons who are rebelling, and he's locked in the dungeon in manacles and guarded. And basically, St John of Beverley prays, he desperately prays, St John, please help me. And here's an interesting thing, because St John, unlike St Leonard, who was a patron saint of prisoners, St John was famous for this sanctuary thing. And you could come and take sanctuary in Beverley Minster. So he was somebody, say if you were in prison, you would pray for, look, if I can get out, I can get to Beverley Minster and claim sanctuary, I'll be all right. So this is what happens in Cottingham Castle, and the guy prays to St John of Beverley, and this happens. A similar thing happens in this story to another guy from Driffield Castle. A bit of wit still survives as a town. He's called Samson. This is a little bit confusing time. He's put under guard in the aforesaid castle. The guards asked Sir Robert what to do with him. Sir Robert, who's in charge of the castle, says unless they can redeem him quickly, the teeth will be torn out of his head, and he would send some limbs of his body that had been cut off. Then the youth was terrified. He ceaselessly petitioned divine aid over this, and also the protection of St John. Does that satisfy a definite intercession request to St John? And St John heard him. And St John, who is a protector of all unfortunate people throughout the country of England, heard the prayer of the humble petitioner and compassionately delivered him from the hands of the evil men. And then it goes on to tell you a story about what St John had done early on and it had helped somebody. Eventually, basically, because we don't have time to go at all, you can read through it at length, so I'll just summarize the best to you, is that his manacle chains fall off him, like the previous case. The guards fall asleep, either because they're either ostensibly drunk or they're just tired. The castle hasn't been terribly well looked after, so the door's probably rotting off and he gets out. And St John of Beverley guides him. But then it's discovered that he's gone, and so the guards chase after him. And St John protects him by guides him through various woods and gets various other villagers to sort of help him. So he's either disguised, but he basically avoids being captured on the journey from Driffield down to Beverley. St John of Beverley has told him, go to the high altar and place one of the manacles that are still around your wrists on the high altar as an offering and claim sanctuary, and then you will be safe. For 30 days, they will not be able to touch you, which is the law. So eventually he gets to Beverley through the intervention of St. John. And he does that, he goes to the high altar, puts down the manacles. But he's left barefoot. So his feet are cut to ribbons, shredded through all the stone. And he's exhausted, knackered, terrified, psychologically out of his wits, badly beaten up. And bizarrely, St. John of Beverley sort of blesses him when he gets to the altar and says, now, about your feet, go and see the physician and get him to heal them. Which is what he does. Shouldn't it have been the other way around? St. John of Beverley should have healed the feet and allowed him to stage the prison break out. What do you think? The other most famous miracle associated with St. John, of course, is the mute boy, which this here, I think, is the very first of the miracles. So it's the boy who's got ringworm, which is a wonderfully detailed description. I think it might be on page 148. You've got two here. Oh, you've got the nun with the great swelling of the arm at Wotton on 148, chapter 5. This is from Full Card, I think. And prior to that, St. John, yes, chapter 4, 147. He gave speech to someone who was mute from birth, and he cured the same of his diseased head, which was covered with ringworm. Now, this is a wonderfully detailed story in 148. And this there, we don't have time for me to completely read it out, but so many of you will know it. It appears in Bede, it appears in Alcuin. It's the first miracle associated with St. John. It's why he's associated as patron saint of the deaf and the dumb, the mute. Because this boy has been mute apparently from birth. When we read about Jesus' miracles in the Bible, it normally says, say with the women caught in hemorrhages, or that Jesus healed her instantly, and she felt the power come out instantly, and he was instantly healed. It hardly ever says that about St. John's healing miracles. It's not instant. In fact, once you read quite closely, in implication, it's taken quite a long period of time, weeks, maybe months. And this boy, who is mute, who is probably, I don't know, psychologically traumatized or whatever, or can't speak, or maybe there's something with his tongue, St. John of Beverley basically places his finger on his tongue and teaches him his alphabet. A, B, C, D, E, as detailed in the story. And then he goes on to teach him sentences and how to say a whole sentence. It's not just the vowel sounds. This is basically speech therapy. The implication is that it's spent over a period of weeks or months. The boy is fully healed with this. The ringworm, I think in this particular account, again, St. John of Beverley says, go and see the doctor. And that's a fungal infection, and you need a special lotion to get rid of it. But he has actually healed, and the boy, of course, is healed, and he speaks again. Is that a miracle? Or is that just very good speech therapy about 1,300 years before its time? And maybe the medical knowledge of the 7th, 8th century and the Middle Ages is a lot better than we thought. Because it does throw up that question. Maybe there's more classical antiquity medical knowledge known. Remember, St John of Beverley had a very good education. And he was a healer. And also this recognition, even by a saint. And going back to how I started off, I'm a Christian, I believe in miracles. And I'm a man of faith. But also I know sometimes I need to go to the doctor and take some tablets. And praying is not going to get rid of whatever illness I've got. I need a prescription. I need an antibiotic. So I don't leave my sanity behind just because I'm a person of faith. Even though I know many, many, many GPs, and I know one who's helped me with this in the audience, have often told me that the vast majority of their patients, the best prescription for them was the placebo effect. Mind does work over matter, and if we prescribe you some sort of drug that makes you think you're feeling better, it will give you hope and confidence and allow your natural immune system, your white blood cells, to work in a much more effective way than it would have done if you had been frightened, anxious, upset, worried, finding it difficult to sleep, agitated off the diet. The placebo effect normally works, which brings me back to St. Augustine of Hippo and his definition of a miracle. That the greatest miracle of all, the miracle of miracles, is the world itself. I am arguing that the whole point of theology as an academic discipline is to try to bridge our scientific and rational minds with our spiritual and religious ones. The Anglican Church famously places its position on a three-pointed stool of tradition, reason, and scripture. And all three are required to actually understand how God acts in the world, or how he inspires or motivates us in all sorts of ways. But also, just think, we're looking back at stories, the earliest of which is 700 years ago. The oldest is 1,300 years ago. Of this St John of Beverley, largely forgotten, patron saint of England, who has the longest hagiographical story of any saint in Christendom. And what, in 700, 800 years' time, will our successors think when they look back on those people living in Beverley in their 21st century who were so scared about cancer and stuff like that? And didn't they know that 500 years later, somebody will invent, or 100 years later, somebody will invent a tablet or something like that, which means cancer just goes, and you don't have to have operations. Like in Star Trek, Dr. McCoy saying, the barbarity of 20th century medical science. They want to cut you up. No, I can just use this magic wavy electronic device that will just heal everything like that. Maybe it is. The world is such a wonderful place, we're just trying to understand the laws of physics within it. In a final conclusion, and this is really obvious, I tried to explain this on a birthday lunch with the vicar and his wife, that if we are ever to get out of the solar system, we will have to break not just Einstein, but all sort of theories of what is the fastest object, which is the speed of light. We will have to go at least 10 times faster than the speed of light in order to visit the nearest star, which is 10 light years away. And it will still take us a year to get there, and we'll have to get back. So unless we can invent light speed, as in Star Wars, or warp speed, and there is actually a guy in Cambridge University, I was told of, who is deliberately employed by the university to do research into time travel and try to find out how time travel works, because under Einstein's theory of special relativity, it is actually theoretically possible. Because if he does, then obviously Cambridge University will become very, 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 very rich and important. We actually will have found a way of actually making space exploration something in which you can actually get out of the solar system from. You might have some chance. But it shows that laws, in some respects, laws of nature, need to be broken by a clever mind. It will take Isaac Newton, the early 17th century, to work out all that guff about gravity, velocity, the speed with which you hit the ground. So, therein, I conclude my talk and invite you to general questions. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Marcus. Any questions? I'll do my best to run around with the microphone.
I think, Marcus, it was a very interesting talk and some very good stories told to us. I think when they're written down, you have to ask yourself, why was the William was it Kettle?
William Kettle, yeah.
Writing in the Minster, what was the purpose of what he was doing? And he was telling this wonderful story about the boy falling from the roof. And he doesn't want to end the story with saying the boy was smashed into 1,000 pieces, because he wants people to come to the Minster. It's extremely expensive. Building the Minster, the more pilgrims you get, the greater the money going into the coffers.
Yeah.
And so they want to let know that there were miraculous healing.
Yes.
But I think you have to think in terms of what was their purpose of writing.
Oh yeah, no, absolutely. And in particular, to reply to that, don't forget that the William Fulcard and William Kettle are members of the Beverley community. They have parents in Beverley, they have brothers and sisters in Beverley, nephews, nieces. They've grown up, been educated alongside and played in the street with other children. They are family chaplains. Quite often, on several accounts, William Kettle refers to 2 women who were healed in 2 separate accounts, and you have them in there, of women he knew personally, who were either crippled or ill, and he describes them as a friend of mine, and she went to St John of Beverley, she pleaded, and he healed her. So there's a personal family thing. This is not just an eyewitness account, it's a family thing coming from the community. And it's clear he's writing this to celebrate St John of Beverley, but to tell you a family story. This could have been his cousin, probably would have been. That's what is struck by the St John accounts. And so many of them also refer either to a friend, or it was a cripple in the marketplace that I knew who used to beg there every week, and goes on with this remarkable personal description about how I knew them before and I knew them after, and that the intimacy of writing you get that, most people can't read. These are very early accounts from 1066, 1120, 1130. Printing press isn't going to be 300 years down the line. And actually all the big pilgrimage cult relics are written by Bede and Alcuin already. St John of Beverley has been attracting pilgrims for 400 to 500 years. If anything, I could argue, but it's quite possible that the Minster canons are a bit fed up of all these pilgrims that keep coming in all the time, because it's probably a nightmare managing them. And they must get frustrated and, oh, great, we've got another 100 turning up and they weren't praying for that.
Footfall is always money.
But anyway, does that partly answer your question?
How long ago it was, but it was a long time ago, when there's a school in New York for deaf, and we're not allowed to say dumb people, are we nowadays, but who had difficulty in speaking. And they came over here for a weekend, and it was absolutely fascinating. We were in the Minster, and we were singing hymns. And I thought, oh, well, this is a pity, they're going to miss all this. And somebody did sign language, and they sang the hymns with their arms. It was a wonderful sight to see, because they couldn't hear a word. But the leader of the group told me that when they're trying to get somebody to learn to speak, they do all the things in the mouth that St John was supposed to have done.
Some of the St John miracles in terms of healing the deaf, and that's who becomes particularly associated as a patron saint of the deaf. I've made notes, and you do have copies of them. What is my explanation of what happened here? And normally it's just a classic young boy, 10, 12, that's quite a commonality. Been deaf since birth, so maybe mute as well. He's just deaf. Prays to St John of Beverley. St John of Beverley heals him. Sometimes St John of Beverley puts an ointment in his ear or something like that. And I've discussed this with a friend who's a GP and thought, well, what do you think could you give a diagnosis and what was wrong with the boy? And how could St John of Beverley have healed this? I mean, could it be simply he had an ear infection? Could it be that he had tinnitus? You know, he had been the blacksmith's son, and the sound, the noise of the blacksmith striking the bone was about like the equivalent of a child having listened to too much on their Walkman heavy music and have lost their hearing. Could it be as a child he had actually got something stuck in his ear, in the wax there, it's stuck there, and that St John of Beverley had removed it? All these things are possible explanations which could explain how this healing happened. But also it took St John of Beverley to notice this. Because, you know, if St John of Beverley or one of his priests, his clergy, had not looked at this little child and sorted out whatever it was, the ear infection, or you need the wax taking out of there, or this little child's toy you've got stuck in there, or there's something else, the poor child would still be deaf. Everything comes back to what is it you call a miracle? Now, I would still see that was God's Holy Spirit being active in the world, and through the intervention of St. John or his followers, inspired, however, a lot of people achieved an awful lot of healing. And I don't think I'm mad. I hope not. I was inspired in this approach by a guy called Colin Humphreys, who is a committed Christian, wrote a best-selling book called The Miracles of Exodus. He is a current professor of physics at the University of Cambridge. And he goes to the book of Exodus. He lays his hand quite clearly on the deck, says, I'm a committed Christian, but I'm also a professor of physics at Cambridge. And they demand their pint of scientific blood out of you at Cambridge University. So this award-winning book, he goes and he tries to explain how the burning bush really happened, how the plagues, the locusts, the hails, the death of the firstborn really happened, how the parting of the Red Sea really happened from a scientist's point of view as a professor of physics. And he does it amazingly well. You know, it has wonderful, it was a winner of the Science and Religion Templeton Prize, which is sort of the £1 million prize. I encourage you to read this. It was only Colin Humphreys, The Miracles of Exodus. It's in paperback now, The Scientific Truth of the Exodus Miracles. But he makes it very clear from the beginning, he's not trying to debunk these. He's not saying that they're no longer a miracle. Now, for the burning bush, he explains by volcanic vents, which have come up in the ground around the burning bush. The plague of locusts follows the plague of hail. Well, if the hail had happened in the desert in the summer and made it muddy, you would get a plague of locusts. The parting of the Red Sea, he points out, actually, it's a typographical error. It says in every Bible, in the footnotes, it's not the Red Sea, it's the Sea of Reeds. There's an extra E in it, which is a bit like Morecambe Bay, where the Cockle-Shell people got stuck. And it has unusual currents, depending on the wind in which it parts, and you can cross it, but only for a few hours. Moments later, as the winds change, you will get stuck and you will get drowned. It's still a miracle because obviously at the very precise, most convenient moment, the Israelites get across, but the Egyptians don't whilst they're pursuing them. And he argues, you just think, all right, okay. You know, but he's very clear that he is a Bible-believing Christian as well. So I encourage you all to go to Beverley Bookshop and earn this and give it an Amazon review. I'm very good at trying to get Amazon reviews for people and ratings.
Sounds like a topic for another lecture. Just picking up on Pam's point about asking who are these texts written for? Why are they written? I'm struck that the full card account of the healing of the lad who is deaf and mute, and Bede's account, which is 400 years earlier, Bede's account is actually much more detailed about the mechanics of the speech therapy and teaching him letters and constructing sentences. Bede gives more detail of that, and it's Bede who says, and then he sent him to the doctor for a poultice for his scalp. which suggests to me that Fulcard's purpose in writing was much more to evoke faith, to actually highlight the divine element in it. But actually, as you say, if the whole world is the theatre of God's glory, then everything is a miracle. You can give thanks for somebody surviving a fall of 50 feet, and you can give thanks for your breakfast.
Fulcard is also using bead as his source material. He's reading this 400 years later, found it in the library of the Minster. Oh, all right, okay, that happened here. So I don't need to tell you more because there's a beads bit there, and he's a better writer than I am. I mean, you haven't heard of Fulcard, but everybody's heard of Bede. Even at the time, before, all right, okay, I don't think I'll top that bestseller, but what do we add to this?
We'd better draw a line there. Thank you, Marcus, for giving us such an interesting take on the miracle stories of John of Beverley, or some of them. We'll go and investigate the other 69 that we didn't have time to look at this evening. But thank you for a fascinating talk. Folks, these lectures have been free, but we do invite a donation of say £5 if you're able to afford that. And there is a dish on the way out. If you're able to make a contribution, that would be very warmly appreciated. And we look forward to our next talk from Marcus, which will be on Wednesday, the 30th of July, which is sort of John of Beverley Part 2, when we shall be looking at from marshland to monastery and the origins of Beverley as a monastery founded by John. So hope you can join us then, 7:30 on Wednesday, the 30th of July. Thank you very much. Good night. God bless.
Thank you.